Hi guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. And what we're going to do today is look at a migration snapshot, specifically of Ireland. And we're going to do this using the Knowledge Center on Migration and Demography's Atlas of Migration, which is a really great source of information on migration in the European Union. If you're interested in more on the Atlas of Migration, you can check out my video here. I'll make sure to also link it in the description below. And I do have a whole series on other snapshots, so if you're of course interested in other countries, you can check that out here also, and I'll link it in the description below. So now let's jump in and get started, because I want to cover quite a few things today with regard to migration in Ireland. I'm going to look at the population of emigrants and immigrants. I'll look at residence permits and visas issued. We'll look at asylum applications. We'll also look at one measure of irregular migration. We'll also look at citizenship and naturalization, as well as some indicators of social inclusion. And we'll round it all off with looking at education and employment. So now let's just jump right in and talk about the population. So the population of Ireland is almost 5 million people, and of those 5 million people, 6% are immigrants coming from outside of the European Union, and 7% are immigrants coming from within the European Union. So that means that 13% of the Irish population is an immigrant. Now, that is just looking at immigrant stocks in 2020, but now let's turn and look at flows in 2018. And if you're interested to learn more about the difference between migration stocks and migration flows, you can check out my video on that. I'll link it here and make sure it is put down in the description below. Now let's jump in and talk about annual flows in 2018. And that means we're going to talk about the number of people coming in and leaving Ireland in 2018. So let's first talk about immigration, or people coming in to Ireland. So in 2018, 65% of the people who entered Ireland were coming from within the EU, and only 35% were immigrating from outside of the European Union. Now, if we talk about emigration, or people leaving Ireland, then 54% were leaving and going to another country within the EU, whereas 46% were leaving and going to a country outside of the EU. Now let's look at residence permits, and remember also residence permits are mainly for immigrants coming from outside of the EU, because usually European immigrants don't necessarily need residence permits. Now, what we can see here is that, very interestingly, the majority of residence permits that were issued in between 2016 and 2019 were for educational purposes. This is actually quite different than many other countries. Again, if you want to compare this to other countries and different snapshots, you can check out my videos on those. There were also then around 20% during this time period that came in on work residence permits, and then a small portion for family reasons and other reasons. And other reasons here could be things like seeking asylum or gaining refugee status, for example. If we also look at valid residence permits at the end of the year in 2019, you can see it's quite evenly split between these different groups. But again, education plays a very high role here, which is quite different again than other countries. If we look at asylum seekers between 2016 and 2019, you can see that the numbers were growing over time, although not extremely high compared to many other countries. But like many other countries, there were higher numbers of men compared to women who put in a first application for asylum. If we now look at the first instance decisions, what you can also see here is that there's actually quite a lot of rejections, particularly in 2016 and in 2019. A very high number of the applications put in were actually rejected. There were still those that did receive refugee status, though, under the Geneva Convention, as well as some kind of other subsidiary protection or some type of visa for humanitarian assistance. Now, let's also look at one indicator of irregular migration. And how can we do this? We can look at the number of people who were ordered to leave the country in a specific year because they did not have the right to stay in Ireland, and compare that to the number of people that actually returned. And between 2016 and 2019, we see here that only between 18 and 24% of the people that were told they no longer had the right to stay actually left. And that is then a gray area of people who did not return, and they will generally end up in some kind of irregularity. Now let's turn and look at naturalization and citizenship. And what does naturalization mean? So naturalization has to do with people gaining the citizenship of the country that they are in. So in this case, it has to do with nationals from other countries gaining the citizenship of Ireland. And you can see this broken down here by both immigrants from the EU and immigrants from outside of the EU. And very similarly to many other countries, more citizens from outside of the EU decide to gain citizenship in Ireland compared to European citizens. Although, again, maybe compared to some countries, European citizens are perhaps also gaining citizenship at a bit higher rate than they are in some other countries. But again, it's mainly people coming from outside of the EU. And this makes a lot of sense because European citizens already have very similar rights as Irish nationals, whereas people coming from outside of the EU can gain a lot more from actually gaining the citizenship. Now let's look at some indicators of social inclusion. And the first one I want to look at here is income. And what you can see here is that in general, nationals have a higher rate of income than immigrants, but the differences are not huge, especially not compared to some of the other countries that we've looked at in this snapshot series. If we look at overcrowding rates, though, which have to do with the number of people living in one household, you can see that there's definitely higher overcrowding among immigrants and the highest overcrowding rate amongst EU immigrants, which is interesting and slightly different than some other countries that we've looked at again in this series. Now, if we look at the risk of poverty or social inclusion, both of adults and children, what we see here is the highest risks of poverty and social exclusion are amongst migrants from outside of the EU, but actually migrants from within the EU have slightly lower risks of poverty and social inclusion compared to nationals, which is quite interesting and quite different than many other country contexts. The risk of poverty for children also is similar, but still higher for non-nationals. Now let's look at educational attainment by these different groups. And what you can see is that all three of these groups have quite high levels of high education, again, compared to many of the other countries that we have looked at in this series. So nationals and EU immigrants actually look very similar, whereas non-EU nationals actually have even higher rates of high education. In general, immigrants from outside of the EU here seem to be much more highly educated than nationals. And interestingly, and kind of flipped compared to other countries that we've looked at, nationals have higher numbers of people in that low educated category compared to immigrants. Now let's look at some labor market indicators, and the usual labor market indicators we'll look at are employment and unemployment, and here we can also see it broken down by different age groups. And what we can see is that the employment rates actually amongst nationals are not necessarily better than those of at least EU immigrants. But if we look at unemployment, again, nationals and EU immigrants look very similar, and we don't have very much information here about immigrants coming from outside of the EU. So let's now look at the employment rate by educational attainment, and we'll look at high, medium, and low education. And what you can see very clearly here is generally the higher levels of education you have, the more likely it is to be employed. And the differences here are not very big between the nationals and immigrants. What we actually see is in some cases, the European nationals are actually outperforming the nationals. And the immigrants from third countries are in a slightly worse position, but also not doing extremely poorly, especially when we compare it to other countries. Now, this was just a very quick snapshot of the migration situation in Ireland. I hope it was useful for you. If you liked it, please do give it a thumbs up. Definitely don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos that I upload on migration every week. I do hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.